Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hi. So I am here to introduce Marty Suydam, but before then, there's a couple things I'd like to draw your attention to. We have several. This one? Oh, okay. I'll stand right here. Mark is going to make sure that you can hear me. No? This one. There's another one here. I have to sort of position my mouth for both. Yeah.
Okay.
Is it on? No. Oh, can we put that one here? Now, can you hear me? Oh, okay. So honey, we're not going to want to hold this. We want to put this in here. Please do that. Okay, we're getting there, people. Hold on 1 second. Oh, look at that. It's like a paper clip. Okay, got it. All right, now. So everybody can hear me in-house? And can you hear me on Zoom?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay, we're cooking with gas now. All right. So my name is Annette Benbow, and I'm chair of the events committee for the Arlington Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome everyone here in-house as well as on Zoom for tonight's presentation. Before I introduce Marty, I want to draw your attention to some two upcoming events. And if you pick up the piece of paper that we have on the table, or if you look on our website, which David is probably going to put in the chat room for the Zoomers, then you'll be able to see everything. But I want to draw your attention to it because they're pretty special events to us. The first one is Sunday, April 28th. Weird day, right? Usually I'm talking about Thursdays. Well, this is a Sunday. This is the 28th of April. And this is a partnership with several churches. There's a long list with the Black Heritage Museum, with Challenging Racism, with a lot of different groups to bring you An Ordinary Hero, a conversation with Joan Mulholland. As you probably know or have heard, Joan was a serious protester for civil rights in the 1960s and 50s and 60s. And she was arrested several times, and she counts among her close friends many of the icons of the Civil War era that we have become household names. So we're going to learn about her at the church. It's going to be at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, and it's going to be at 2:00 in the afternoon. So it's after church for some of us. And we're going to hear from her personally. She will be there to tell us what it was like and to give advice to the next generation of people seeking to make this country the great nation it should be. Okay, so that's again, Sunday, April 28th, 2 p.m. at St. Mary's Episcopal Church. And then the other event I want to draw your attention to is that I know, how many members do we have? Hands up. Oh, we have a lot of members. Excellent. That's lovely. And this day is especially for you. It is Thursday, May 9th. It is the annual AHS members meeting. We are going to do it online as well as here in-house. And we have two things on the docket to get your opinion on. And one is to expand the number of members of the board of directors. Our nominating committee has totally outdone itself, and either that or no one said no, which is fabulous, and we feel really good about that. So we have to expand the number of people who would be members on the board. We think this is a good thing, and we will tell you more about that on the thing. The other equally important issue, we have to do one before we can do the other, and that is we will want you to vote to sanctify, if you will, the slate of board members that the nomination committee is putting forward. Now, all that information is on the AHS website, and that is Arlington Historical Society, one word, .org. So you can go and look and see for yourself who is there, and we will be having their bios up and on the website in the next couple of days. So that is immediately followed. Don't leave your seat. Don't log off. May 9th, 7:15, that we're going to be talking about Crandall Mackey. And our Michael Lee Pope, who's an author and a journalist, and has written a book on that called Shotgun Justice, a crusader against crime and corruption. He is going to be talking about Crandall Mackey and will tell us, I think, the rest of the story after he does that big raid on Roslyn and all the brothels and bars and all that. What happens afterwards? So that's actually 3 events. I'm sorry, I cheated. But they're really important and should be a lot of fun. Okay, now what we're really here for is to learn about the Rambler from Marty Suydam. Let me tell you a little bit about Marty. He is a longtime resident of Arlington. He's retired now, but he's had careers in government, Army, Defense, and Navy, industry, General Dynamics, Alcoa, JJMA, which I don't even know what that stands for. There we go. Burke Industries. He's a consultant. This guy will not stay home. Am I right, Marty?
Moving, right.
In more ways than one. He teaches. He's teaching now for 55 plus, right? Encore Learning. Thank you. And he's taught at George Mason, Washington College, and Marymount University. There's much more about him, but I think I will let him do his presentation instead. So please help me welcome Marty Suydam.
I'm going to try to sit on a chair. Is that okay? And I want to make sure, get a sound check. David, you can hear me out in Zoom land?
Yep, you're coming loud and clear.
And you can hear me in here, correct? Okay. Well, you know, I normally, for the last year, have been out there in Zoom land doing what David, who is our president, is doing for me tonight, because I'm sitting here doing this. And so that just gives you a little insight into this. The title of this, you know, the Rambler, but when I coined this one, I said, from the lens and pen of the Rambler. The Rambler was more than just a journalist and an author. He was a fantastic photographer. And so that's where I really started to uncover his stuff, was in the photos. And there's just a wealth of them that are out there. But in many cases, there was no attribution to the man who did all of this work. And so that's what this is all about. What I've done in here, I will color commentate, but I've recorded a lot of these in the slides, just because some of them, I mean, the writing is so great and it's so easy to screw it up if you are reading it, you know, like I would be reading it. So I've done that, but I'll color commentate on each one of these as we go through it, just to give you an understanding of it. And again, for most of it, not for this first couple minutes, but for most of it, these are the words of the Rambler. And rather than, I had a hard time figuring out how I would do this, because the man wrote so well and so interestingly that, you know, you could summarize things. Nah. So you're going to get it, and we'll be focusing in on Arlington, Virginia, primarily, of his writings back over 100 years ago. So let me see if I can get the sound working on this thing too now. This is a preview of a 3-year research effort to find and catalog all that the Rambler published. The work is the basis for a 5-session course, Walks with the Rambler, which will be about Arlington history as reported by the Rambler in the early 1900s, and will be offered by Encore Learning in the fall 2024. This presentation is a preview. When writing Walks with Charlie, 3rd edition, a book that is part memoir and part 2020's hindsight perspective on the history of South Arlington, I found the work of photographer and newspaper columnist J. Harry Shannon. I was able to weave some of Shannon's stories into the book. Moreover, I became a fan of the man who died nearly 100 years ago.
The research into Shannon included discovering and curating most of his published articles, over 650, and many others suspected to have been written by him before he had his own column, The Rambler, in the Washington Sunday Star. This image appears in the beginning of the book. This was Virginia, 1900 to 1927, published in 1998. The book is a collection of glass negatives photographed by Shannon. The caption on the book reads, "Mr. Shannon, the journalist photographer who is the illustrious man we pay homage to in the following chapters, was born 3 April 1869 in Baltimore, Maryland. His early boyhood years, however, were spent in Anacostia, District of Columbia." A reporter for the Evening Star from 1890 to 1895 and a member of its editorial staff from 1900 to death in 1928 at age 58, the Rambler became Shannon's nom de plume after the success of his weekly series of articles in the Washington Sunday Star from 1912 to 1927. His widely read Rambler articles reported Mr. Shannon's rambles through the Washington, D.C. and neighboring Maryland and Virginia from 1912 to 1922. After a 2-year lapse due to illness, they resumed from 1924 to 1927. The first title of his articles was The Rambler in Old Nooks and Crannies About the City, which gave way to With the Rambler from June 7, 1914. From August 6, 1916 onward, his articles were entitled The Rambler Writes Of, or The Rambler Visits, or The Rambler Discovers. He described houses, forts, businesses, schools, clubs, churches, creeks, groups, mills, monuments, roads, people, and families.
You know, that I mentioned in that about this finding of this book. There was a book that was published back in 1998, and it turned out that there was a couple that found 1,800 glass negatives, and they decided they were going to buy them for the glass. And when they got them, they found these were the photographs that he had put together. And then they could trace them back to some of the articles starting in the early 1900s, back to the Washington Star. And then they were able to piece together some. And I pursued a lot of that trail, that little breadcrumb trail that's there.
Shannon's articles and picture collection are a historian's treasure. He visited places of historic significance and interviewed residents, including surviving Civil War soldiers. His writing style is chatty. Reading his newspaper articles is like traveling in a time machine. You are there seeing and meeting people with first-hand accounts to history, and it is only you, the reader, who is traveling along with him.
This is a picture that's appeared now in advertisements for this session tonight in various newspapers around town. I think Annette's been planning all of them, but I'm not sure. But at any rate, this is another picture of the man. And you'll notice in the headline, the caption at the top, he has always gone by, he always went by the Rambler, but then it was also later J. Harry Shannon. And it took me 3 years till I finally found out what the J stood for, John. So now you have a secret to this thing, because people say, oh, I know who the Rambler is. It's J. Harry Shannon, but you didn't know what his first name really was.
As a boy, natural history and collecting relics were interests that remained with him throughout his lifetime. Another early interest, noted and appreciated in the October 22, 1880 Alexandria Gazette, was oration. The column states, J. Harry Shannon, the boy orator, will give an exhibit of his wonderful powers at Armory Hall tonight. The press of the country speak to the highest terms of the boy and the entertainments given by him. The Philadelphia Press says he renders the thoughts of the most eminent writers and dignity and eloquence which cannot be surpassed. Among the selections tonight will be Lee's Farewell to the Army. J. Harry Shannon rambled around Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia on steam or electric railway or the steamboat down the Potomac, horseback, bicycle, or on foot. The description of churches, graveyards, old homes, and their families, battlefields, and the roads he traveled came from someone with easy command of the English language. He conducted his own historical and genealogical research. His knowledge of the topography of the region and his familiarity with the various forms of local vegetation are clear. All these attributes made his articles popular with thousands of readers. Most of him knew him only as the Rambler.
Camera.
Usually on foot, when the distance from Washington City was too great, he used the steam or electric railway or the steamboat down the Potomac and then walked, and with him carrying his camera, tripod, supply of photographic glass plates, notebook, and perhaps his lunch, he recorded his keen observations by word and by picture, which formed the basis of his writings. The Rambler's camera, an Eastman View No. 2, was like the one shown.
It's amazing that all of this traveling he would do by horseback, bicycle, walking, lugging, and this is, look at the size of that in terms of the scale of the man and the whole supply of glass negatives that he would be filming from, not the least of which also he had his lunch. So, so you get a sense. I put that picture, that sketch of the picture next to it, so you have some sense of the size of what that thing is that he lugged around town. Now, this, by the way, is the first known piece that he did, and he didn't do it under the banner of the Rambler. And again, this is not an eye test, by the way. I mean, even when you blow that one up, it's very difficult to read. But at any rate, that's the first one. And this is his early articles. Before he got a full column, he would be labeled as the Starman. But then I found lots of starmen later. So I had to read all these articles and then put them next to the ones that I knew were his in order to trace them back. But I uncovered a fair amount of them. But the pictures are always the clue. If I can trace it back to a picture that appears in there, and there are a couple in here that were in those glass negatives, that in fact, then that traced it back to his work.
During my search for all his articles, I found photographs and writing style in earlier editions, before 1912, of the Sunday Star that I thought were Shannon's. Another researcher, Edith Sprouse, a local historian, in late 1970s, while searching the Star microfilm at the Martin Luther King Library in Washington, D.C., also noted the similarity to Rambler style in the manuscript This Was Virginia, 1900 and 1927, in which the author sometimes identified himself as the Starman. Ms. Sprouse further said the earliest exact match was in the May 7th, 1905, Part 4, page 6, Sunday Star, and an article entitled Belvoir and Its Departed Glory. One of the 4 or 5 photos exhibited were copies from our glass negatives and originals of the others perhaps destroyed.
That's Ms. Sprouse.
My search located several more articles, but this effort was much more difficult since there were other Star reporters and writers who referred to themselves as the Starman.
So now you got an introduction into the Starman. He is yet to become the Rambler. Now, this is a sample of what the half-page pieces would look like, but they're not easy to navigate. And by the way, he had a following of tens of thousands of people who read his column every week, and they would carry them around, walking the places that he walked, doing it. But you have to have a little navigation training here to figure out how to do that. So then I decided to do that.
This is a general guide on how to read the Rambler columns, although they do change over time. This one, December 29th, 1912, was at the end of the Rambler's first half year, starting in July 1912. In this case, here there are 3 types of stories in the column: a lead story, a separate, not usually related to the lead story, and a special detail story. I'll read the introductory teaser paragraph for each. The lead story, with the Rambler in odd nooks and crannies about the city. The Capitol Grotto is a fascinating resting place in summer, but at this season, nobody lingers there. This grotto, or summer house, as it is officially known, was touched on by the Rambler last summer in a little journey among the Lovers' Lanes, Lovers' Rests, Lovers' Leaps, and Devil's Jumps in and around Washington. The resting place in question is the red brick, low octagonal structure in the northwest grounds of the Capitol at the parting of the North Walk with one of that sweeps around from the north side to the West Plaza. The roof, which covers the 22 stone seats, is open in the middle, making of this rest an open court save for the boughs of tall ailanthus and catalpa trees that spread above it. One side of this grotto opens into a dim and rocky cavern where shadows linger, ferns grow, and water splashes from a hidden city water main. Many spring and summer courtships have flourished there. Many lovers have sighed there.
The man writes and paints pictures with words, and you can see those. And my intent for the course this fall will be to walk these are primarily in Arlington, but using old topographic maps, retrace all of these stories in and around Arlington in particular. But he writes, this one is, that one was about the District of Columbia, but it keeps going on here.
The standalone story, an old-fashioned car. The electric car, or better, the electrified car that runs back and forth across the Pennsylvania Avenue Bridge and for some distance up Pennsylvania Avenue extended, is a relic. When you enter this car, there is something reminiscent about it, sort of a sensation that carries you back to youth. You cannot at first tell what it is, but there is a familiar tone that wafts over your memory back to the time when the boundary was actually the northern boundary of the city, when there were old-fashioned residences on F Street and few stores on 13th and 14th Streets, when the only shopping district was the 7th Street and market space, when there were no very tall buildings, no automobiles, and no all-night lunch houses, and so many other things to which we have become so accustomed that they sometimes seem to have been always with us.
It's almost as though he's writing today, but remember, this is over 100 years ago, and he's writing of another 100 years, or not quite 100 years, but maybe 50 years back in time too. So this is special to me as a historian who tries to trace these things and try to get as close to firsthand as I can get. He does that job. And then there's this last piece that's in here.
The detailed special story, the remains of Fort Lincoln and Battery Jameson earthworks. A man of statistical bent might computer estimate the number of travelers who pass along the Bladensburg Road from the boundary of Washington to Bladensburg, Hyattsville, and beyond. The number is large. The country bordering the old post road is being fast settled and built on. The foot and wagon traffic is heavy, and an electric car jolts to and fro from this historic way. But of the stream of humankind that flows here, not one man in 1,000 crosses the fields that lead to the crest of the ridge on the southeast side of the road and over the northeast end of which the district line runs. This is unfortunate because from this height may be one of the finest, broadest prospects in the environs of Washington. The National Training School for Boys occupies the southwest end of the ridge, which rises from the vale through which Hickory Run flows, gains an elevation of 218 feet, and 1.75 miles to the northeast drops down into the stream with jungle sides that run through the dual ground of Bladensburg. From the Bladensburg Road, the ridge rises for 1/4 mile to the crest. Then one comes to a stretch of high land marked by undulating fields and thick woods broken by some rolling hills and deep and wild ravines. The ridge then drops sharply to the marshland bordering the eastern branch. Access the ridge from the Bladensburg Road to the river. The distance is about 1.5 miles.
Now, those are just teaser paragraphs from each of these 3 sections. And in general, his columns were structured like that, although they would change. Sometimes he would get into a whole music theme, and he would be lots of characterizations of performers and things like that. But every one of them is different. So now let's get to Arlington, Virginia, because these were original early ones of his. Now we're going to go to our Arlington. And so let me start this one.
Now that you have a feeling of how the Rambler columns were structured, I'll dive into only a few columns that are all about Arlington County and include descriptions of Fort Richardson today within the Army-Navy Country Club campus, with this picture of residents living there in 1912 among the ruins. Green Valley,
That's one of
not
his
the new name
pictures.
for what was once called Naught,
That's another of
but
its
the
pictures.
1,000-acre Fraser plantation, of which this is a picture of the no longer existing manor house, taken by the Rambler. Prospect Hill, with Fort Albany and Mount Zion Church, since they are co-located. Fort Runyon, villages with names of Brickhaven, Freedman City or Village, and Queen City, and Arlington House. We know some of these locations from our 2024 perspective, but they were all very different 100 years ago.
So this is our Arlington, and this happens to be where that house is located is where Forest Hills is today. It's a 3-story townhouses right next to Shirley Highway, and it's across from Fort Richardson. That was all the property of Anthony Fraser, about 1,000-acre hardwood forest plantation prior to the Civil War. During the Civil War, it was stripped. 1,000 acres of trees were cut out. That's same thing happened to Arlington Forest, which was Washington's, forest area too, another hardwood plantation up in the Arlington area. Now, just the next slide I'm going to show you is got. Let me see if I can get this. This is not.
Rambler wrote in the.
This is not to be an eye test, and they're hard to read, by the way. The scanning was not great on this. But until such time, remember I mentioned about this Miss Sprouse who was a historian back in the 1970s, would spend long time in microfilm libraries. I did that years and years ago. Many of you probably did. It's painful and it's hard. It's just hard to do. If you ever want to experience that, by the way, there is a setup in our Center for Virginia History over at the Central Library where you can actually get on one of those old microfiche readers as well. But save you the time from a newspaper standpoint, I adopted newspapers.com as a source for a lot of stuff, and they're adding constantly to it. So just so that you have an idea of what newspapers, it's a subscription service. You can get it for free with some of the libraries around here, Arlington libraries in particular, Fairfax Library as well. So you can actually access and you can search for things. Now, I was searching for things in Arlington history when I started getting into this, but then I decided I was going to find all of what he did. That's a little different than searching because I could find newspapers and then I had to find where in the newspaper his articles would be. And then I would try to match them up. And then I would think I had everything. And then I'd realize I didn't. I would find others. And so it's a total right now, it's over 650 of pages that look like this in what is a website. And I'll show you that toward the end.
The Rambler wrote in the Evening Star, January 3rd, 1913, quoted a Civil War veteran. I helped to build this fort, working a week at spading on high-level land half-mile south of the Columbia
This is
Pike,
Fort
and
Richardson.
a quarter of a mile west of the little stream Long Branch, which ripples down Green Valley. My regiment was the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, the first siege train organized after European models on this continent. My company, G, was recruited at the Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut, and information of the knowledge of mathematics which a number of the men in this company had coming to the attention of the regimental and other high officers, among others, was taken out of the ditches and set at work of computing ranges by triangulation to all prominent or possibly important points within range of the guns of this fort. The soldier, a little stooped and gray, pulled from his pocket a large notebook of yellow paper and once was white. It was written all over with ink lines that had faded until they were very pale. This book contained the original data. Here was jotted down the distance to about every piece of land that could be reached from Fort Richardson and the problem as it was worked out.
So you're now
Pointing out over the rolling fields.
You're now familiar with Fort Richardson. Fort Richardson is right now at the top of the hill where Army-Navy Country Club is. And there is a monument up there, and part of that earthwork fortification exists up there. The next one, he of course, this would be, I'm just repeating his words. All right. So now he's going to now in this article, he's going to be viewing from Fort Richardson everything around the area that's there. So
The Rambler wrote in the Evening Star, January 3rd, 1913, quoted a Civil War veteran.
Oh.
I helped to build this fort, working a week, pointing out over the rolling.
oh, wait a minute, I got a problem here.
Pointing out over the rolling fields
There.
to the south of Fort Richardson, land leading gently down to the junction of Long Branch with 4 Mile Run, not quite a mile away. The soldier said, the great convalescent camp was spread over these fields, and at one time
Convalescent
there were
camp, hospital.
15,000 men in that camp, just getting strong again after being in a hospital with wounds or sickness. Over there, pointing to the westward in the direction of Fort Barry and Fort Barnard, was the distribution camp. Thousands of men were there. Having graduated from hospitals and the convalescent camp, they were now in the distribution camp awaiting reassignment to their former commands or assignment to other organizations. The big brick house down there in Green Valley was the home of Anthony Frazier, and his children and grandchildren are living there now. I
That's
remember
that picture I
Anthony Frazier
showed you, the
because many
house.
times I went down to that fine old house for milk or water. Fort Richardson and the convalescent camp, I think, were on Frazier's land, and Fort Barry, Fort Bernard, and the distribution camp were on Corbett's land, the Corbett house having been torn down because it occupied part of the site needed for Fort Barry. A great deal of artillery target practice was carried on from these forts, especially from Fort Richardson, where there was organized and conducted for about 3 years an artillery school. Much of the shooting was at targets in the hills south of 4 Mile Run. After I had triangulated about everything that could be reached by gunfire from Richardson, Barry, and Barnard, I was engaged in a similar work for the gunners in Fort Reynolds, Battery, Garesh, Fort Ward, and Fort Worth. I was spotting shots south of Hunting Creek for gunners in the forts north of the valley of Cameron Run, where Fort Lyon blew up. I saw the great cloud of smoke, and a few seconds after heard the roar of the explosion. When the magazine of Lyon blew up, 20 men of the garrison were killed.
That's a first-person narrative of 50 years prior during the Civil War. And so you've got a direct link now to that. It's he interviewed you. Those of you who take my writing a memoir course, one of your assignments is to do an interview and write a story about that. That's always the hardest one for anybody to do. But he had actually spent a lot of time, interviewing these people, firsthand persons.
The Rambler wrote in the Evening Star, January 3rd, 1913, quoted a Civil War veteran.
Oh.
I helped to build this.
Excuse me, that repeated that last one.
From the Washington Sunday Star, August 17th, 1913. Leveling old forts. Every year the remains of the Civil War defenses of Washington grow less. Part of the parapet and ditch of Fort Albany have lately been leveled.
Fort Albany,
You can see the
up
raw
at the
earth left
right
by the
overlooking the
graders as you
Pentagon,
pass along
the end of
Electric
Arlington
Railroad
Ridge.
to or from Alexandria, if you know where to look. It is better, though, to visit the site and remains of Fort Albany. Cross the highway bridge and continue south to the intersection of the Alexandria, Washington Dirt Road and the Columbia Turnpike, and then turn west. You will pass beneath a short iron bridge over which the electric cars run, and you will find yourself on a hard and rough road in the midst of the settlement of Brickhaven. Scores of shanties are strung along the way or slightly back from the road. It is a neighborhood where the hand of the village beautifier has not been felt. The villagers are, for the most part, brickyard workers and their dependents, and many of the homes are unaesthetic and probably insanitary. Here and there are brick sheds, all of them warped and rickety, and a number of them ruinous. At this point, the road is passing through the site of Fort Runyon, the Civil War fort of the greatest size among the capital's defenses. Its construction was begun directly after the crossing of the Long Bridge by federal troops on the night of May 23, 1861. Runyon was a bridgehead fort designed to hold the Long Bridge until a system of defenses could be worked out along the heights by which Washington was commanded. The site of the old fort is a low hill, which has been cut away and scooped out, and its clay baked into brick. Within the walls built of this brick, thousands of Washington people dwell.
So he's standing up by where Fort Albany is, which is at the end of Arlington Ridge, overlooking the Pentagon. He's looking down Green Valley south. And that whole area, which is now Virginia Highlands Park, you may be familiar with that. That was a huge area of clay. And it was clay pits were in that area, and there were brick kilns throughout that whole area. And we celebrate the Freedmen's Village and those locations, but did you hear him mention Brickhaven? That was another shanty kind of town. Queen City was another one of these shanty towns, and they were all in that same general area, you know, that's at the head of Green Valley. And I say the head of Green Valley because generally you're thinking, we don't think of it today because it's all with roads and everything else in there. Army Navy Country Club is up on the west side of Green Valley, and the east side of Green Valley is the one that dips it from the ridge down to what is Army Navy Drive. So that's what he's describing. And then let me talk.
After passing under the bridge of the electric line, your road is gently upgrade, and it is gray and broken stone and dust. Beyond you on the right is the 5-story brick, stone and glass structure used as an oil refinery. Further on, the road dips, and through a fold in the land runs the electric line to Arlington, to Falls Church, Vienna, Fairfax, and scores of other Virginia stations. West of this dip, the road turns yellow, the color of the native clay, and climbs that long ridge, generally called the Arlington Hills, which extends from the Potomac to 4 Mile Run. Where the road seems to reach the crest of the ridge, there is a cluster of buildings. From where you stand, measure a hand breadth south to this group of buildings, and you will see a church. It is a conspicuous object in the landscape and has become a landmark. The front is yellow, and the southeast side, partly showing from your position, is red. There is a small belfry at the southeast corner. Around the church you will see fresh earth. South of the church are the mounds and ridges and ditches which mark the site of Fort Albany, the goal of this ramble. Entering the dip in the road where the electric line crosses, you come upon a small passenger shelter with R-E-L-E-E painted on it.
Robert E. Lee.
In the westerly angle formed by the crossing of the iron and dirt roads, a small village has been lately built. Climbing the ridge and coming to the junction of the Columbia Pike and the Aqueduct Arlington Alexandria Road, you note 2 large stores. One was a 3-story brick, but when the Rambler passed that way, the tin roof and what had been the 3rd story were tumbled and jumbled in the road, having been thrown there by a great storm. In the southwest angle of the crossroad is a fire ruin. Brick chimneys and foundation walls are prominent. Here stood a store that was destroyed by fire a year ago. Turning south from the road junction, the grade continuing upward, you come soon to a point opposite the church. The cornerstone tells that it is Mount Zion Church and that the building was put up in 1884. All around the church are the ruins of Fort Albany, but roads and ramparts have been leveled and rods of ditches filled. The view of the eastward is nearly as broad as from the flag mast at Fort Myer or from Arlington Mansion. To the west, the view commands Green Valley, a vale through which a stream, Long Branch, flows from the Arlington Highlands to the 4 Mile Run. Below you, from this point, lies a broad and interesting prospect. It is a strong industrial tone. In the foreground are spread green fields over which float clouds of white smoke and palls of black smoke from the brick kilns. One can count a score of high stacks and many low, thick chimneys that rise above the roofs of the brick-making plants. there is a clutter of wire-strung poles. 2 lines of grayish-black poles, each with 5 or 6 cross arms, and thick web with wires extend along the Columbia Pike. 2 lines of the poles and wires run along the Aqueduct Arlington-Alexandria Road. One sees the lines of the poles along the electric railway from the highway bridge to Arlington Junction and beyond in the direction of Alexandria. And you can also pick out the poles and wires along the Stream Road. You look down on the long village built by the side of the Columbia Pike and extending from the crossroad near the church eastward until the view of these little houses is smothered in the smoke of the brick kilns. You see yellow fields where the clay has been dug out to a depth of 20 feet by steam shovels. And you see also long lines of yellow clay bank, marking the bounds of these excavations. In the middle distance are the river and its bridges. It is a hazy day, and in a bluish-purple background dimly rise the tall landmarks of Washington. Perhaps also you can trace the outline of the crest to the north and east of Washington and can follow the outline of ridge eastward to the Anacostia River. The church which stands on Fort Albany was organized by ex-slaves soon after their emancipation. During the Civil War, many colored people from Maryland and Virginia sought shelter behind the Union lines and settled in this neighborhood. There was a village called Freedman's Village, which stood close by on land subsequently taken by the government as an addition to Arlington Cemetery when that cemetery was extended southward. There are now several villages of colored people in that vicinity, one of which bears the rather ambitious name of Queen City.
This is the image that he took of that church. And if you've been up on Arlington Ridge at the end where Fort Albany and the placard is for Fort Albany, the representative, you know, the high-rise condos that are there, that is right across the street. And you can still see the foundation of this church. The front of the church was yellow and the sides were red. And I was able to place this because of the fact that the concrete is still there. It's like a pad that's there, but I never could figure out the orientation of this church. And that yellow front is like pointed where the Pentagon is. It would overlook where the Pentagon went in. And a lot of people, I was surprised in his writing here that expansion of the Arlington Cemetery, a lot of people say a lot of these places that were in there were eliminated when they built the Pentagon. No, they were eliminated long before that. Okay, so a lot of our history is not quite right in some of these places. Okay. This is a great map, topographic map, that I intend to use as part of the course in the fall. But this is the area that we're talking about here. Here's our Hume School. Okay. And at the end of this road here is where, excuse me. Yeah. Right down in here is the end of Arlington Ridge. You've got, here's Fort Richardson. Oh, I'm sorry. Here, Fort Albany is right up here. I'm sorry. I'm upside down looking at this thing. But here you've got all of the buildings marked on this topographic map that were there. None of that is there now. It's all gone. And again, this is 1917. Of course, during the World War II, a lot of this area got developed where my cursor is running around there with other developments for workers of the Pentagon. Okay. This is a Sanborn fire insurance map. If you haven't seen any of these, we have a collection of them at the Center for Local History at the Central Library. They're spectacular. These are architecturally accurate, and you can build up a whole forensic display or understanding of what happened as you look at these maps. By the way, when you open them up, they're as big as a table would be, a huge table. And they're all hand done. And these were done all over the country. I hadn't seen much of this until I wrote Walks with Charlie, and I spent weeks in the library finding. This happens to be that area where the representative is right now. And this is, here's where the church was, right up here. And the Pentagon is to the right. if you want to, and Shirley Highway, here's where Shirley Highway cut through in here. Okay. Now, this one is just about essentially Green Valley. And here's some of those pictures again. Let me just, this is the Green Valley Manor, which was burned in 1924. Everything was destroyed. And he talks about in this piece, all of the paintings of the family history, furniture that came from the White House, our White House, you know, and was there. This is a spring house that's down near, it was near the intersection of what is now 23rd and Army Navy. 23rd back in, before 1935 was called, anybody? Fraser Avenue. Anthony Fraser was the man who, you know, 1,000-acre plantation that was in this area. But the spring house was one, the spring there is one that George Washington visited in his transits from Mount Vernon and north. This is the barn, and I spent forever trying to find the foundations of that, and I found them. But it burned in 1961 with vandals that burned it. And this one is Prospect Hill, which is the Roach family. Hal Roach, you know, was one of the children, but that was up essentially where the representative is now. All right. And it picked up a name when it was restored of Sunnyside. Sunnyside is a very common name around Arlington, Alexandria, because it's always the sunny side of the ridge. Okay. And this will be almost, you know.
The Sunday Star, March
series of
7th,
extracts.
1915, with the Rambler. Green Valley, beginning in the Arlington Highlands and gently sloping and widening to its junction with the valley a 4-mile run, is a region which, though close to Washington, is neglected by or unknown by the great majority of Washingtonians. The approaches to the valley head from the direction of Washington are in some degree unlovely, but once in this valley or on the crest of the ridges that girt it, its beauty strongly strikes one's fancy, and many stories worth the telling are parts of the history of the valley. There are, of course, more ways than one of reaching Green Valley, but the Rambler followed the old north and south post road, which leads along the east front of Arlington. Because of the improvement of this ancient way, between the Aqueduct Bridge and the Columbia Turnpike, and the new road from the south end of the highway bridge across the Arlington lowlands, now occupied by the experiment farm of the Department of Agriculture.
Remember, it was an
The
experiment
east
farm in
gates
that
of
whole area
Arlington,
near where the
those
Pentagon.
inscribed to Ord and Wetzel, Sheridan and McClellan, are coming into their just estate and fulfilling the purpose of their erection. More and more are pilgrims to the solemn groves and grave-pitted acres of Arlington, coming to make their entrance by one of the east gates. The entrance to Arlington in the days of George Washington Parke Custis and Robert E. Lee, from the time of the building of the mansion to the fortification of the heights, was from the old post road at the eastern base of the ridge.
That old post road was Old Georgetown Pike, which is now Army Navy Drive in this whole area here. Just, you know, this has changed a lot over these years. And then now he's going to talk about, he's going to walk from Arlington House, the Lee Mansion, south towards Freedman Village.
The burial grounds of Arlington have been considerably extended, and the Seneca red sandstone wall topped with slabs of Potomac bluestone has been lengthened so that its southeast angle encloses the site of an early settlement of colored people, which was called Freedman's City. But in that neighborhood, strung along and set back from the old post road and the Columbia Pike, is an irregularly built village peopled by colored folk, many of them descended from those who settled there under the protection of the Union camps, hospitals, and fortified lines, which were a feature of that country during the Civil War. These people grouped or herded themselves there after emancipation, and many of them came before emancipation, hundreds and perhaps thousands of them having taken secret leave of their masters and the old plantations in Maryland and Virginia. A good many of the first settlers survive, and the Rambler, in the course of some of the years of his writing, has transcribed from the lips of these old people many interesting narratives.
In some cases, he'll start recycling, not word for word, but places that he's been to before as he traverses some of these areas. And so now he's working his way from Arlington House down Green Valley, but he's going to cross over now Fort Albany. And again, you're going to hear about this Mount Zion Colored Baptist Church, which you're now experts on what it looks like and where it was located.
Walking southerly along the road from the aqueduct and passing the southeast end of Arlington Wall, a steep grade leads up to the crossing of the electric railway, which runs from Washington by way of the Highway Bridge and Arlington Junction to Falls Church, Vienna, Fairfax Courthouse, and 100 intermediate stops. The point on the road which the Rambler has now reached is marked by a small station called Clark. Here the road starts downgrade and then up, and through the dip runs the Columbia Pike, one of the important lines of travel between the Potomac Valley and the West before the age of railroads, and still a road over which passes a heavy column of traffic. Crossing the Columbia Pike and climbing the grade beyond, you come to a height where, weedy and tangle-grown, rest the ruins of Fort Albany.
So you're coming down where the Shirley Highway is, and you're
a
coming
brick
up
church,
onto Arlington
about which
Ridge.
the Rambler has previously written, and which, from most of the high points in Washington and its northern and eastern environs, is a sky mark on the Virginia hills. It is Mount Zion Colored Baptist Church. It is a bold brick structure with red sides, a dun front,
Dun meaning
and was
yellow.
erected in 1884. The congregation was organized by ex-slaves, either just before or after the emancipation, and that congregation worshiped in a small frame building in the nearby settlement of Freedman's City, or as it was often called, Freedman's Village. That was the village which was wiped out by the southeasterly extension of the Arlington grounds. Living next to the brick church is a colored woman who told the Rambler that her family belonged to the great Fauntleroy family of King and Queen County, Virginia, and her people settled in Freedman's Village in a few days after the occupation of Richmond by federal troops in April of 1865. Continuing south from the church, you are sensible if your road is passing along the crest of a narrow ridge, the sides of which slope steeply to the east and west. To the west is a narrow valley. It is the head of Green Valley. A branch flows through this, and its name is Long Branch. From the various draws and ravines that run down into Green Valley, many little streams add the flow to that of Long Branch, and that branch, before it has followed its course for a mile, becomes a stream of some magnitude, ranging in time of heavy rain and maintaining a very respectable flow even in time of drought. To the east, the ridge falls away to the flatlands which stretch to the river. The eye can pick out all familiar buildings in Washington, as well as on the hills that rim the city on the north, west, and east. It is one of the glorious views of this region.
He talks about Long Branch. How many Long Branches are there in Arlington? There's two. There's Upper Long Branch and Lower Long Branch. This happens to be Lower Long Branch now, but it had and it also has a name within Army Navy Country Club back from the Civil War period called Rocky Run. And if you go onto that campus, you'll see it, and it's got revetment on sides, so it's channeled through the golf course. But that's part of it, and then it feeds a pond, and then it goes underneath Shirley Highway in huge tunnels that go underneath Shirley Highway, and then it surfaces at the south end of Frazier Park. And those of you that have been with me on walks with Charlie know where Frazier Park is. It's the only vestige of the name of the guy who's almost the founder of Arlington. And it's Frazier Park. It's near the intersection of 28th Street and Army Navy Drive. All right, nice little park there. Okay.
A few hundred yards ahead of you and on the east crest of the ridge, rising out of a lacework of trees, just touched with the promise of green leaf buds, you see two tall square chimneys, heavy red brick red
That's
brick walls,
Prospect
white
Hill.
pillared porches, and bright green shutters. It is a noble old house, and you note that some new owner has taken it under his charge. It is sprucing up and telling every passerby that good times have come. For years the Rambler has known that old house. For years it has spoken of its neglect everybody who passed that way. The fine gardens that in happier days bloomed around it and were ruinous and dejected by the old house even when it hungered for fresh paint and stood in dire need of window glass and blinds, always looked proudly, almost defiantly out upon the road. But the house seems very happy now. Prosperity gives it a cheerful tone. The grounds have been cleared up, a jungle of shiftless growth has been cleared away, and the gardener was setting out in fresh new beds scores of ornamental shrubs.
It was essentially
when the Rambler
abandoned and
walked that way.
ransacked during the Civil
Long
War,
before
and
the
up until
Civil War
1915.
That house was just the home
Remained as
of
a
Jacob
shell.
Roach, a considerable landowner thereabouts. He owned a grist mill on 4 Mile Run, and on the old maps you can mark the exact location of Roach's mill. As a contractor, he made much money out of the building of the London and Hampshire Railroad, which became the Bluemont division of the Southern Railway and is now the electric line to Leesburg and Bluemont. The Rambler has been told that James Roach, at the outbreak of the Civil War, organized a cavalry troop, entered the Confederate Army, and did not return to his home overlooking Washington. The place came into possession of a nephew who was a bachelor and finally fell into the hands of others than members of the Roach family. The Rambler has striven to find out more about the Roach family and owners of this land before James Roach came to live there, but his efforts have as yet yielded no fruit. It is said that the land records of that part of the county were destroyed during the Civil War.
It was purchased from the owners, and it was just a wreck. It was a member of Congress, a representative from Kansas in the early 1920s, and he restored the whole house. It was gorgeous, but his children did not care about the house, and thus they sold it when they built the representative. So it was demoed at that time, but it had kind of two lives. And that was, gorgeous. That truly looked like a mansion. Some of these that they call mansions back then looked just like farmhouses. That one really looked like a mansion.
After turning your back on the ruins of Fort Albany and starting toward the old Roach house, you come to a fork in the road. The left fork continues its course along the backbone of the ridge, and you follow it to the old brick house with big chimneys, white porches, and fresh green blinds. The right-hand fork leads down the west slope of the
Now
ridge
you're going down to
into
Green Valley Manor.
and either by turning back or by cutting cross lots down the hill, you can get into this road. This is a part of the post road which connected the New England colonies, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, with the Carolinas and Georgia, and passed through Bladensburg, Georgetown, Alexandria, Dumfries, and Fredericksburg on its way to Charleston and Savannah. It was the road over which George Washington traveled between Mount Vernon and the north. The road along the top of the ridge is a newer way, though its age is great as the ages of roads in this new and fast-developing land are measured. Along the older road, the oak-grown ridge slopes upward to the left and far out to the right stretches of Green Valley, now become much wider than when you had your first glimpse of it from where Fort Albany stood. The bed of the valley is not flat, but a succession of low hills and short ridges with vales between. On the opposite slope and on the crest of the farther ridge are a few houses, nearly all of them new.
Those were on the Army-Navy Country Club campus of today. They were up on that hill.
And lines of cedars and patches of pines give a cheering touch to the view. A mile or so further down the valley, so far down that the ridge beyond 4 Mile Run has charged from light, misty blue to the rich purple, you come to a place where the main road veers from the south to the southwest and a private road leads straight ahead. At this parting of the ways, the Rambler pauses for a few minutes. Down the private road can be seen through the bare branches of many oaks an old house of most substantial build and so well cared for that but for its chimneys, its dormer windows, and other architectural features, you might mistake it for a new house. Venerable trees grow above a well-kept lawn. a nearly clipped box hedge, and a lily pond at the foot of a flight of steps leading up a terrace are items in the picture. Under the trees is a rustic summer house, very like that which the Rambler found on the grounds of the vineyard adjoining the Soldiers' Home and wrote about last fall. On the hilltop, off the main
Across
road,
from it,
and about a
Army
third of a
Navy
mile
Country
from the
Club.
house, is a thicket of tall cedars, their trunks interlaced with honeysuckle
The
vines that have kept
cemetery for
green
the Fraser.
all winter. In this melancholy place with an iron fence are tombstones. On one of the monuments, the Rambler read the names and dates. William Fraser, died October 1824, aged 75 years. Mary Fraser, wife of William Fraser. Anthony R. Fraser, born November 12, 1794, died February 1, 1881. Prussia Lee Fraser, wife of Anthony Fraser, born 1791, died 1859. William Lee Fraser, born February 17, 1824, died July 7, 1868.
Before Shirley Highway was put in, what was Fraser Avenue that came off the ridge and down past Green Valley Manor and across that, what is that, the bottom of that valley, and then up the slope, which is where the cemetery is. That was the extension of Fraser Avenue. It was a dirt road at the time. You can see that on the maps there, but he's just described all of that. And his description of going into the house is pretty incredible too, or looking around this house. I used this in order to really find the location when I was writing Walks with Charlie. And I ended up finding a man who actually borrowed things that were garden plants that were around that house so we could actually find its actual position. If you're familiar with Forest Hills, it's at the intersection of South Queen and South Rolfe, which is where that house was. A lot of the history documents of Arlington would say it was up on the ridge. Why wouldn't it be up on the ridge? It seems like a great place, right? No water. The spring house. This is down by where the spring house is. And the spring house served also Fort Richardson on the far hilltop, which you could see from this house.
This information is enough to show the reader that he is now upon the Fraser estate of Green Valley, which gave its name to this region, and that the old house down the private road with the box hedge, the terrace, the lily pond, and the rustic summer house is the old Fraser mansion.
Great picture.
The Rambler spent an interesting hour there. Anthony Fraser was the owner of this land when camps and forts covered it from 1861 to 1865. He was an old man then. He had become blind, and the members of his family have told the Rambler that his greatest sorrow was to listen to the sound of hundreds of axes as Union soldiers felled the forest on his land, that the fort guns might have clear field of fire, and no cover might be afforded to the enemy, and that timber might be obtained for revetments, for the earthworks, for barracks, for the convalescent camp close by, and for many other purposes. In that old house today lives a daughter of Anthony Fraser and his wife, who was Miss Prussia Lee of Montgomery County, Maryland. The name of the woman is Mrs. Sickles, Mrs. J.E. Sickles, if the Rambler remembers the initials. Her daughter and her daughter's husband also live there. They are Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Carter. The house is full of old mahogany and antique rugs. Oil portraits of the Frasers line the walls of one of the rooms, and a feature of the dining room is one of the white marble mantles that was taken out of the White House when changes were made in the house during the term of President Roosevelt.
The Mrs. Sickles referred to here was the wife of a civil engineer, I interviewed the great-granddaughter of Mrs. Sickles, but I also interviewed a woman who Mrs. Sickles was living in what was the servants' quarters for the Green Valley Manor, which was not burned when Green Valley Manor burned. But Mrs. Sickles was living with her daughter there, and this woman who actually went to Hume's school, and I've written up that in Walks with Charlie, said mean old Mrs. Sickles would take out her gun and shoot at us when we were out throwing rocks at that house. So mean old Mrs. Sickles. So and then I have one last little short, one paragraph left of this of this paper that I believe in.
On this estate is a spring, which, for centuries, has been enclosed by a stone spring house. That spring has been familiar to travelers over the post road through Green Valley for 2 centuries. George Washington, traveling over that road on horseback or in a coach, liked to stop there to drink, and there is a legend that he used to tie his horse to a persimmon tree of great age, which grows close to the spring.
I didn't even know what a persimmon tree looked like or what the fruit looks like. It's kind of tomato-like looking, but there's nothing there today. I mean, obviously this ancient tree is gone. Okay, now we're winding up, and you can read these, but he had an absence from May 22 to April 24th that I'd mentioned earlier. And these were the columns that appeared. They were just inserted into the Star newspaper on May 1922, and then when he's back. And so following April 1924, then he's back. But he died in 1928, and his not only is his the obituary interesting reading, but also there was a tribute to him, and I've recorded those as well. So this is not in J. Harry Shannon's voice, but you hear what people thought of the man at the end. And again, he was 58 years old, so he was still a young man, really.
J. Harry Shannon, the Rambler, dies. Veteran member of Star staff, had great fund of local history. J. Harry Shannon, veteran member of the editorial staff of the Evening Star and popularly known to thousands of readers as the Rambler, died yesterday morning at his home, 4200 42nd Street, following a relapse from a previous illness. Although he had been in poor health since 1922, when he suffered a severe nervous collapse, his death came as a distinct shock to his legion of colleagues in the newspaper world, who had watched him gamely battle for the return to health and his beloved ramblings. His death marks an untimely 30 to a newspaper career as varied as it was colorful, and deprives the district of a resident whose fund of information, history, and reminiscences of the national capital was unexcelled in his day. In a letter to the editor of the Washington Star, February 17, 1928, headed "High Tribute Paid to the Rambler." Thousands of readers of the Star, like myself, never knew Mr. Shannon personally, but certainly no local writer ever had as large and enthusiastic an audience as he. With the clippings from the Star in our hands for guidebooks, we followed on foot, horseback, and in autos the roads and trails he described so picturesquely. He led us to long-forgotten but historic old homes hidden in the country around this city and told us of their past in the most attractive manner. He took us through deep woods, along lovely little brooks and streams, where, hidden away from prying eyes, he showed us the crumbling walls of old grist mills, revolutionary foundries, once splendid old colonial homes and log cabins of the early settlers. He peopled them with real flesh and blood, men and women, and made them live again in our imaginations. We followed him down old roads, once highways, the wheel tracks and ruts now overgrown with grass and brush. They led us to once important settlements now forgotten, but all but for the Rambler and his love for delving into the past, plus a keen instinct for research. He told us more real local history than all the historians. He showed us more beauties of nature than all the artists. He made many long summer Sunday afternoons ones of real adventure and profit. I'm sure there were 10,000 or more scrapbooks in Washington that are fairly bulging with clippings from the Star written by this kindly man who called himself the Rambler. They will furnish the motif for many a future happy outing by men and women, now children, to whom he will be only a name. We shall all miss him. May he continue to ramble over there amid green fields and green pastures.
It's nice to have that said about you, for a guy that did a lot. He had a big following, and, they had these scrapbooks, and of course they were cut from newspaper print, and they all deteriorated. And there was an attempt, I think back in the 30s, of making a book out of some of this, but they used newsprint too. And to the best that I can tell, are none left. They just disintegrated. And so, accessing this great archive that I was able to do primarily through newspapers.com, but also the local libraries, our local libraries here. I've been able to resurrect this. And so I created this website, and I did it with the purpose of this course in the fall, but I've cataloged all of what he did, and they're all organized by year, and then they're linked with also transcriptions, and I'm putting those in now. It's still a work in progress. But let me see if I can try to do this. This is the last slide, by the way. So if it blows up on me, we're at the end. Let's see if I can get this to go. David, is that showing in Zoom land?
I'm only seeing the same slide.
You're seeing the same slide. Well, I'll show the people here and I'll get out of it. But at any rate, there's pull down menus. And so if I go to something like 1916, here are all of the pieces that are in 1916 organized by when they were published. And it gives the key stories that are maybe in that particular edition. And then I'm adding here where it says transcripts. This would then take you to what is a transcript of the text that's in there, because the actual, so there's what the transcripts look like. And then if I go back to, let's say, one of the pages in this opens this up in newspapers.com.
We're not seeing the website.
Say again?
We're not seeing the website.
Yeah,
All
I
we're
know.
seeing is the slide.
I'm essentially done. So let me just back out of this. And you can now see that. So that gives you an idea of what it is, but there's a total of, as I said, over 650 of them, and they're all connected in a database. So if somebody wants to start searching, they can just go to a particular edition. But I spent forever trying to find, those Sunday Stars, if you remember, that was one healthy paper, hundreds of pages in for a particular edition. So just even finding this was like a needle in a haystack, but they're all there. Now, anybody got any questions in-house? Yeah, go ahead.
You know where he's buried? It's the first one, and do you know where his negatives are now?
Yeah, the negatives are in the DC. The DC library, I think, has them in there now. The class negatives. I've written that up. I can't remember the exact location, and I don't know where he's buried. It's a good question. I'll have to find that. But I was more interested in his work than visiting his grave, to tell you the truth. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The question was, what did he die of? And he had this nervous disorder that, he was out for 2 years, and it was he recovered for a couple of years, and then it finally got him. It was a surprise, though. I mean, he had seemed to have made a recovery, and then that was it. Yeah. But he was 58 years old. So, yeah. Yes, question.
Dad used to love read a column called The Rambler, the Star in the 1960s. They simply reused the name over the years.
Perhaps. Yeah. The question from the floor was, my dad used to read the Rambler in the Star in the 1960s, and I don't know that, because it's certainly, there are other Ramblers, by the way, that are out there in other locations, and they may just have recycled the name. Yeah, I think you're probably right, but we know he had a finite time of actually doing the work that he did, which was pretty prolific all on its own. Yeah. Right. No, well, in the area of the question was, what is the road which was referenced in there that George Washington traveled, through the colonies, and it was called the Old Georgetown Pike, and then it is now in the section from essentially Arlington Mansion all the way down, not Arlington Mansion, yeah, but up by where it intersects with Shirley Highway, Army Navy Drive, which is really named after Army Navy Country Club, which was founded in 1924. All right, but it runs parallel and on top of what was the original post road. Yeah. Yeah. So when you're down, when you're on Army Navy Drive, you're really on a historic road bed area. And finding where that spring house was took me a fair amount of time too, because that's where Washington would stop and water his horse and so on. And that's where the persimmon tree was. And so, but that spring house became like a side, like a road stop back in the early 1920s. They built the stone benches and picnic tables and everything else around it along that road. And I have pictures of those as well. Now, the Rambler didn't take those pictures, but I have them from the newspaper here. Other questions? Yeah, question.
Is the guidebook?
The guidebook? Oh, you mean, like I did Walks with Charlie and Walk 4 Mile Run? I don't, that'll be this fall. Yeah. And I've still got to craft all of that. My biggest problem when I assembled all of this was it was so much. And figuring out, nobody's going to want to buy a, I don't know, 5,000 page book or something. That's by the way, that book of the pictures, you can get that on the internet. This is Arlington 1920. I think it's it's the time period of his writing. So it's the 1920s and so on. And it's pretty expensive. I mean, I did buy it, but it's not a cheap book because it's got not all, but a significant amount of the 1800 pictures that he did with some little captions by them. So it's a pretty nice document too. Yeah. Yeah. Question.
Did he ramble outside of Arlington?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Not Fairfax. It was in this area around, he would get out to maybe the beginnings of Fairfax County for us. Yeah, the question was, how far did he ramble? And he rambled a lot in the district. And he rambled in Maryland, I'll say probably 20 miles into Maryland on the east side. So, and then south would be down through Alexandria. And there were some that would be just south of there. That he would get to as well. But again, all this was on horseback, bicycle, and walking. Sometimes he'd take a steam rail or the electric railway or something like that, but he was always lugging around that camera, huge camera, and all the plates and everything else. So, yeah.
Anything from Zoom?
Huh?
Anything from Zoom?
David, anything from Zoom? I see there's a bunch of chat in there, but I think you're taking a look at that.
I am, and there's no real questions except for a request that we add the Rambler website, that we feature that on the Arlington Historical Society website.
Couldn't hear. I can't, I'm having a hard time. Did anybody else, can you hear him?
Yes. What's the name of the website? Is it a Rambler website?
Oh, my website, my Rambler website? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay.
What's it on?
Let me stop sharing. I can't